Loss, a concept we all struggle with, whether it be friends, loved ones, or even one's own home. Loss is a terrifying beast, and it proves to be with the story of this one man, known as the Chained Man, or as he prefers to be known as, Zion. This is his story. The story begins on Zion's home planet, Hallow, a planet with no color, only blacks, whites, and grays. However, the people of Hallow didn't mind, and neither did the 13-year-old Zion, who had been studying the planets and an odd phenomenon that happens to some planets. A phenomenon known as crumbling, where a planet will suddenly break upon itself for no observable reason. However, Zion had formed a theory as to why a planet crumbles. The core of a planet serves as the heart to a planet. And much like how not every person has a good heart, the same can be said for the cores, as it appears that whenever a planet crumbles, their cores had seemingly stopped, much like a heart attack. Zion left his father's study, a room in which his father had only recently given him permission to be in alone, and rushed to find him. His father was a lead scientist in the eyes of Hallow's government, a masterful scientist at that. His father chuckled heartily at his boy's research, grabbing hold of the paper Zion was holding deep in his grasp. After moments of silence, his father erupted off his chair and rushed to his study, Zion following suit. His father effortlessly broke through the southern wall of his study, white sparks crackling off his fists as he ran into the uncovered safe room. Zion stood at the doorway of the safe room. He had never seen his father this moved by something before. The people of Hallow were surprisingly powerful in comparison to the normal human. The strength it would take to make someone from Hallow even budge would be equal to the force of armor-piercing shells. Yet, even with that knowledge, Zion would struggle when his father picked him up along with some of his patented warp pads, paired with him hearing his father call out to his mother. Zion would be set down in front of his father and mother, both of them talking between themselves about something the 13-year-old Zion couldn't even understand between the chaos. Then suddenly, the ground below them began to shake and crack, along with the view outside, trees crumbling down and large buildings crashing to the ground. Zion's ears began to ring as the chaos ensued, his parents rushing around the house, his heart pounding in his chest as their thoughts rushed around his head, scrambling to put together a coherent thought. Minutes of silence pass, and after a chunk of his house crashes down beside him, the realization hits him. Hallow was crumbling, and his theory was confirmed right in front of his eyes. The symptoms of a planet pre-crumbling were serious earthquakes, none that the crumbled planet had ever seen. The ringing stopped right as his father kneeled down in front of the horrified Zion, ushering instructions to him before he activated the warp pads. Before Zion could even respond, in the blink of an eye, he was in an open, bronze-colored field, the pads dropping off him as they sizzled out. He fell to his knees, eyes wide, hands shaking. He cursed to himself, hitting the ground as tears gently fell from his face. Several minutes would pass, Zion getting up from the crater he had created, white sparks jolting from both him and the creator. He thought back to the instructions his father had given him. They were simple, and although Zion shuddered at where they led, he had no choice, given that his home was now gone. A realization that still crawled in his mind as he had set out to his destination. The destination he had been told to go to was the location of an old family friend. Someone Zion wasn't too fond of, but someone his father had trusted dearly, especially with situations like this. But to the misfortune of Zion, his trip was cut short by someone zipping in front of him on an old rusted hovercraft, and before Zion could even walk past them, a rag was held to his mouth, his vision fading to black soon after. Fear. Another concept we struggle with. We tend to feel fear when we're faced against something we don't know, can't overcome, or when we're stuck defenseless with someone who intends to bring us harm. This is true for Zion, or as you will soon learn to know him as, the Chained Man. This is his origin. Time had passed. How much time had passed he didn't know. All he knew was that time had passed when his vision and conscience began to come back. He tried to move, but was quickly stopped by the chains holding him still in the dark room he was stuck in. His pale clothes were covered in dirt and stained with spots of blood, and his body was slim enough for his bones to begin showing. It was clear to him that too much time had passed, and that he was starving and aching in pain. He heard the sound of a door opening. He looked in front of him, and the only thing he was met with was a small dish of food being slid in front of him, and the silhouette of the person who had locked him up. He stood there and looked at the food. Then he looked back at his hands. They were shaking, and his wrists bore the shackles that held him to the wall. The chains rattled as he had begun to shake more, tears trickling down his cheeks when the realization crawling around his mind finally bit at him. He was alone, and his family was gone, along with his home and anything he had ever loved. They all vanished right before his eyes. He knelt down and picked up his meal. He ate it slowly, trying to quell the fear and loss that had washed over him, along with trying to figure out his current situation and how he could possibly get out of it. Years would pass, and everything began to loop for him. Eat, be brought out to work away, be thrown back in his small room, and sleep. It was a nightmare for him. A nightmare he couldn't wake up from, nor would he ever wake up from. Until, at the age of 25, the loop had begun to drive him mad, the rattling of his chains echoing through his mind, and the screams of agony he'd hear from the other captives, paired with his own. His blood began to get heated as days went by, and eventually he looked at his shackles like he did every single day. In his malnourished body, he grit his teeth before he let out a scream and ran forward, fueled by nothing but rage and fury. His chains rattled before quickly tightening into groaning as I pulled at him, the stone of the wall cracking as he continued to push, the shackles digging into his skin and leaving marks. His captors ran to his door, sliding open the peephole to look at where the sudden outburst is coming from. All they saw was a man with long black hair and pale skin, with once black eyes burning red with rage, staring them down, sparks of red and white jumping off his body. The wall that held his chains finally broke apart with the chains that bound his shackles to the wall. He stood there panting before he furiously broke through the door effortlessly, continuing to scream in rage as his captors began to run off in fear. He quickly ran and grabbed hold of one of them, throwing them through another door, breaking the chains of another captive. His rage kept on burning, and after what felt like hours of rage-filled screams, paired with the agonizing screams of the captors, he walked outside and tore off his old, worn shirt, his scarred and bruised torso being exposed to the outside world. His breath was heavy, and it shook as the strain on his body started to kick in. A few steps later, his vision snaps to black. He wakes up and finds himself in a pure white room, and in front of him stood a figure whose head billowed like an active fire and whose face was only but a collection of stars. The figure snapped its fingers, and a fresh set of clothes were adorned on him. A white suit, black undershirt, white tie, and a pair of white shoes. The figure whispered to him, saying only but one sentence. "We hope you enjoy your new job, chained man. Or should we say, Zion, judge of the cosmos." Zion only sheepishly nodded and stood up on his feet. The figure opened a door in front of him, showing him an office, along with handing him a small stack of books. And that is how we found Zion, and that was his story. And we thank you for listening.